battlefield is a forest. No cities under siege. No fleets at sea. No famous generals trading cannon fire across open fields. Just snow, timber, rivers, and a disputed line on a map that two countries both claim is real. That is the Aroostook War, often nicknamed the Lumberjack War, a border crisis between the United States and Britain in 1838 and 1839. It is remembered as bloodless because it did not produce a large battle with mass casualties. But that label can be misleading. Thousands of men were mobilized. Arrests were made at gunpoint. Armed camps formed across a remote frontier. Governments spent major money. And everyone involved understood a simple truth: if one frightened militiaman fired the wrong shot in the wrong place, the United States and Britain could fall into a real war. This is the story of how that almost happened, and why, in the end, it didn't. To start, you have to go to northern Maine and western New Brunswick as they were in the late 1830s. This was not a neat border with clear markers. It was wilderness, in the literal sense. Vast evergreen forests. Long winters. Rivers that served as roads when they froze. Trails made by sled runners and boots. Settlements were small and scattered. Communication was slow. And the people living there were often closer to their nearest logging camp than to any capital city that claimed to govern them. At the center of it all was a place many Americans and British officials could barely picture: the Aroostook Valley. If you stand there in winter, the land feels empty, but it wasn't empty. It was contested. It was valuable. It was filled with trees that could be turned into money, and rivers that could move that money downstream. This war begins, like so many border conflicts, with a map problem. After the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 tried to define the boundary between the new United States and British North America. But in the Maine and New Brunswick region, the treaty language was vague. It referred to highlands and river sources in a landscape that had not been properly surveyed. People argued over which ridgeline counted as the highlands. They argued over which river branch was the true headwater. They argued over which interpretation fit the treaty's wording. And when maps are unclear, people fill the gaps with what they want the map to say. For decades after 1783, both sides claimed overlapping territory. Sometimes the dispute stayed quiet. Sometimes it flared. Commissions tried to measure and compromise. Negotiations dragged on. Meanwhile, people lived, worked, and moved in the region as if the question could be ignored until it couldn't. Then Maine became a state in 1820, and the border dispute took on a new intensity. Before statehood, the dispute had been handled through Massachusetts and the federal government. After statehood, Maine's leaders saw the border as a core issue of sovereignty. Maine believed it was entitled to its full claim, and it expected Washington to support it. In Maine politics, the border wasn't just an abstract line. It was land and money and pride. On the other side, New Brunswick had its own reasons to stand firm. New Brunswick's leaders viewed the disputed zone not only as land but as strategic space. The British Empire had learned the hard way in earlier wars that communication and movement in North America could decide campaigns. A secure corridor connecting the St. John River system to Quebec mattered, especially in winter when other routes were difficult. To British officials, losing that corridor could weaken defense and control. So you have two very different pressures pushing toward confrontation: Maine demanding its state boundary and resources, and New Brunswick protecting what it saw as strategic routes and colonial security. Now add the fuel that turns a political disagreement into a frontier crisis: timber. By the 1830s, lumber was booming. The forests of the Northeast were not just trees, they were wealth. Pine and spruce could become masts, boards, and building material. Rivers could carry logs in spring drives. Contractors and crews could make fortunes in a good season. Towns downstream depended on that flow of timber. This wasn't a side business. It was a major engine of the economy. And the disputed Aroostook region was prime timber country. That meant loggers from both sides moved into the same valley and cut the same forests. Some were Americans working for Maine interests. Some were British subjects from New Brunswick. They often lived in rough camps through winter, then drove logs downstream when spring thaw came. In a region with unclear authority, the question became simple: who has the right to cut these trees? For Maine officials, New Brunswick logging in the disputed zone looked like theft, British subjects stealing Maine's resources. For New Brunswick officials, Maine logging looked like the same thing in reverse: American encroachment into British territory. And in a frontier environment, theft doesn't stay a legal term for long. It becomes a reason to bring armed men. By 1838, tensions in the woods were rising. Reports of intimidation and clashes among rival crews appeared. There were rumors of violence, rumors of planned raids, and rumors of armed groups preparing to defend their claims. Whether every rumor was true didn't matter as much as the fact that people believed them. Fear travels faster than certainty on a frontier, and once fear is widespread, it shapes decisions. The crisis reached a turning point in early 1839. Maine sent a state land agent, an official responsible for protecting Maine's public lands, into the disputed territory with a posse. The goal was to enforce Maine's authority and confront illegal logging. In practical terms, this meant moving into contested space and acting like the government in charge. The land agent's party made arrests. It seized property. It treated New Brunswick logging crews as violators of Maine law. From Maine's perspective, this was law enforcement. From New Brunswick's perspective, it was a provocation, possibly even an invasion. Because if another government arrests your people on land you claim, it's not just a police matter, it's a sovereignty challenge. New Brunswick responded quickly. Colonial officials and local leaders mobilized their own militia and forces. Arrests went both ways. The number of armed men in the woods began to rise, and the risk of a spark became obvious. This is the moment where the Aroostook War becomes a war, not because shots were fired in a major battle, but because the logic of escalation took over. If Maine backed down, Maine leaders feared it would look weak and lose its claim. If New Brunswick backed down, New Brunswick leaders feared the same. Both sides started calling up militia and moving forces into position. And that's where this conflict becomes far more dangerous than a lumber dispute. Because once armed men mobilize, accidents become strategic events. A fistfight at a logging camp could become a diplomatic crisis. A misheard command could become the first shot of a new U.S. British war. It's hard to overstate how serious that possibility felt in 1839. The United States and Britain had fought a major war just a generation earlier, in 1812. Memories of burning cities, privateers, and border fighting were still alive. And in the late 1830s, the U.S.-British relationship was not completely calm. The Patriot War raids along the Canadian border had recently raised tensions. Trust was not unlimited. So when Maine mobilized thousands of militia, and New Brunswick mobilized its own forces, it wasn't just local politics. It was international danger. Maine's governor at the time, John Fairfield, took a hard line. Fairfield supported firm action to defend Maine's claim. The state called up militia and began preparing posts and supply routes. Maine's leaders wanted to show that they would not surrender their boundary through hesitation. On the British side, New Brunswick's leadership also acted firmly. Sir John Harvey, the Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, had to protect colonial claims and prevent what he saw as American encroachment. He also had to manage the risk of escalation. If British regulars fired on American militia, the situation could explode into war. But if New Brunswick did nothing, it could lose control over a strategic region. This is what makes the Aroostook War a classic border crisis. Each side believes it must act to prevent losing ground. Each action increases fear on the other side. Fear leads to more action. And the cycle tightens. Then you add the harsh reality of the environment. This wasn't a conflict in a comfortable place. It was winter in northern forests. Moving men meant feeding them, sheltering them, keeping them warm, and guiding them through terrain that could kill people even without bullets. In a sense, the enemy for both sides was not each other. It was logistics. A militia force doesn't survive on courage alone. It needs flour, meat, blankets, powder, and medical support. It needs sleds to move supplies over snow. It needs roads or frozen rivers. It needs discipline to prevent sickness and disorder. A large mobilization in deep winter can collapse under its own weight if supply fails. That logistical pressure shaped decisions. It increased costs. It forced leaders to decide whether they could keep men in the field or whether they had to de-escalate before winter made the crisis unmanageable. And it created another dangerous factor: bored, cold, nervous men with guns. Militia units camped near each other, facing an enemy they couldn't always see. Rumors circulated constantly. Each campfire story could raise tension. Each mistaken sighting could trigger a false alarm. In a crisis like this, avoiding war becomes an active job, not a passive hope. This is where the U.S. federal government's role becomes crucial. Maine could call up militia, but Washington had to consider the national consequences. President Martin Van Buren did not want a war with Britain. A war would be expensive, politically risky, and potentially disastrous for trade instability. Van Buren also understood that if Maine dragged the United States into war through reckless action, the federal government would bear the cost. So Washington's goal became balancing. Support Maine's claim and credibility, but prevent escalation. That's a delicate line, and in American history, federal-state tensions over war and diplomacy are always tricky. To manage the crisis, the United States sent one of its most respected military leaders, Winfield Scott. Scott is remembered today as a major figure in 19th-century American military history. In 1839, he was already known for professionalism and discipline. Sending Scott was a signal. It told Maine that the federal government was taking the crisis seriously. It told Britain that the U.S. wanted to prevent escalation. And it gave Washington a steady hand on the ground, someone who could negotiate, calm local leaders, and keep armed forces from stumbling into conflict. Scott's mission was not to win a battle. It was to prevent one. That kind of mission is easy to underestimate. It requires persuasion, credibility, and an ability to give both sides a way to step back without humiliation. In a border dispute, pride can be as dangerous as guns. If leaders feel they must save face, they may keep pushing even when they know pushing is irrational. Scott worked with Maine officials and with New Brunswick's leadership to arrange a temporary stand-down. The idea was straightforward: reduce forces, avoid direct confrontation, and hold the situation stable until diplomats could settle the boundary. In practical terms, it meant agreeing not to flood the disputed zone with troops and not to treat every logging dispute as an act of war. This is the heart of the Aroostook War, the moment when restraint becomes policy. When both sides accept that stepping back is not surrender, but strategy. The immediate crisis cooled in 1839. Camps began to break down as winter eased. Men returned home. The war did not explode into battle. That outcome was not guaranteed. It was the result of choices by state leaders, colonial leaders, and federal authorities who decided the cost of escalation was too high. But the story doesn't end there, because the underlying border dispute was still unresolved. If the Aroostook War proved anything, it proved that the border problem could not be left to drift. It had to be solved. And that leads to the long-term solution, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. In that treaty, the United States and Britain finally settled most of the Maine and New Brunswick boundary through a compromise. Maine did not get everything it wanted. Britain did not get everything it wanted. But both sides got what they needed most: a stable border and reduced risk of war. The treaty also reflected the strategic realities behind the dispute. Britain secured key route interests. The United States secured a recognized boundary for Maine. And both governments could claim success to their publics. The Aroostook War, then, is best understood as a warning flare. It forced both sides to treat the dispute seriously. It showed that local actions, arrests, timber seizures, militia musters, could create international crisis. And it demonstrated that the US-British relationship, while improving over time, could still be shaken by frontier pressure. Now, because this conflict was bloodless, it's sometimes told as a joke: lumberjacks squabbling, politicians grandstanding, militia marching around in snow. But that framing misses what was really at stake for the people living there. For militiamen, the war meant long marches through deep snow, poor shelter, and constant uncertainty. Even without combat, winter mobilization could kill through illness and exposure. It could ruin livelihoods by pulling men away from work. It could leave families without support. For loggers and contractors, the crisis threatened economic disaster. Timber seasons were short. A seized camp or lost log drive could wipe out profit for a year. Men who depended on winter wages in the woods could suddenly be trapped between competing authorities. For settlers near the frontier, the war meant fear and instability. Rumors of raids or arrests could cause panic. People might stockpile supplies, board windows, or avoid travel. The border region's everyday life could be disrupted for months. And for governments, the costs were enormous. Maine spent heavily on mobilization and supply. New Brunswick did the same. All for a crisis where the goal was not to fight but to avoid fighting while still protecting claims. This is why the Aroostook War deserves a serious documentary treatment. It shows that peace is not just the absence of battle. Peace can require active management, logistics, discipline, negotiation, and political courage. It also shows something deeper about how borders are made. Borders are not only drawn by treaties. They are also shaped by what people do on the ground: who builds roads, who enforces arrests, who cuts timber, who shows up first with authority. The Aroostook War happened because the map was unclear, but it escalated because both sides tried to make their version of the map real through action. In the end, the Aroostook War did not produce a famous battlefield. It produced something more subtle, a lesson in restraint. It showed that the United States and Britain could step back from the brink and choose negotiation over escalation. In a century that would see many wars, that is not a small achievement.